I know you're all really excited about this topic because I know how exciting internal controls and payroll are, and then we just combined them. But seriously, we've been really talking about internal controls this last year, so we thought it might be a good presentation to kind of correlate internal controls with something that you guys actually do, to maybe ease the pain of identifying and developing these internal controls. So a lot of this information as we go through and talk about controls, if you've went through our internal controls manual that's on our website, you'll recognize some of the terms that we're using and the application of these. There's also examples in there that we're going to go over too that are specific to payroll. So the topics we're going to highlight in the payroll presentation here are internal controls, procedures, documentation, responsibilities, reporting, and then we'll go over some payroll issues and concerns, things that we've had questions on in the past, things that we've talked about in the past. When we speak about internal controls, one of the first things that you have to address are the objectives of your internal controls. And then you need to make sure that you're addressing the 5 areas: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, and that's where we'll hit on some of the examples for payroll, and information and communication and monitoring. So when developing your internal controls, objectives is probably the most important thing that you need to consider, and it will overlap into all of these things. So as you develop them, you have to consider each of the objectives. The objectives are how efficient and effective your operations are. The primary objectives for payroll would be operations, reporting, and compliance. The operational objectives really, when we talk about effectiveness and efficiency, I know sometimes you don't get both of them. So that's something that you try to focus on when you develop them, is that they're doing both of those things. Your operations are basically include the functions to process payroll from start to finish. They ensure the accuracy of your hours, pay rates, withholdings, check and deposit amounts, and recorded to the appropriate funds for the correct amounts. Also making sure actions are performed in a timely manner and you have proper authorization. The reporting objective focuses on the reliability of reporting for internal and external uses. Internal reporting would include things like your accounting records, your financial reports, grant reporting, and various payroll reports, such as time and attendance records, distribution reports, earnings reports, withholdings reports. External reporting would include reports to other agencies, such as IRS reports, Department of Revenue, Department of Workforce Development, PERF, State Board of Accounts, and other applicable agencies. Reports may be on a monthly basis, quarterly, or annual. The compliance objective focuses on ensuring compliance with applicable federal and state laws, regulations, State Board of Accounts uniform compliance guidelines, and local ordinances and policies. In many cases, the 3 objectives may overlap and be accomplished by a single action or procedure. An example would be time reporting. In the process of payroll, which is part of the operations objective, hours must be captured to calculate an employee's earnings. But it's also required for Fair Labor Standards Act and State Board of Accounts guidelines to maintain records of hours worked. Units may do this in different ways, but one example would be using timesheets or time cards for each payroll and having them authorized by the appropriate official or supervisor. This action would accomplish multiple objectives. So that's really the idea when creating your controls is, and at first, like I said, identifying those objectives so that when you create them, if you can accomplish multiple objectives with one procedure, that's going to get you the most efficiency and hopefully the most effectiveness. Your control environment. Before you can start to develop your controls, you really need to get an understanding of your control environment. So this is going to set the foundation, your internal control structure, how formal and informal the unit's policies and procedures are, and how much oversight there is by the governing body and management really set the tone for the unit's control environment. The following things should be considered when dealing with the control environment: oversight by the governing body, outline of specific duties within the organizational structure, creating job descriptions and determining skills necessary to perform jobs, designation of responsible persons for each part of the payroll process, documentation of internal control procedures over specific payroll areas, including communication and monitoring, correlation of assigned responsibilities and authorities to entity objectives, establishing a confidential reporting system for individuals to report suspected fraud and abuse of local policies. So once you've developed how formal and informal your unit is with those policies, how well your governing body does with their oversight, how involved they want to be, that will help you develop what your controls are going to be. You may have a governing board that really doesn't care to see too much, and then you might have one that wants to see things down to the detail. So that understanding needs to be obtained before you start to develop these controls so that you can make sure that you achieve them all at once. The next step in your process is going to be your risk assessment. Risk assessment is one of the most important areas of internal control. This is where areas of weaknesses are identified, analyzed, and addressed appropriately. Some things to consider when doing risk assessment are the complexity of the activity itself or the calculation for the activity, such as things that you do just periodically or may have unusual calculations or manual calculations like severance pay, overtime calculations. Some court officials and employees' pay have special regulations or guidelines. Employees paid from grant funding. You want to also consider the susceptibility of the activity to fraud or misappropriation. So making sure that employees involved in the payroll process have maybe restricted authority to do certain things, or maybe they're not in charge of calculating or approving their own pay. So just making sure you have the proper oversight and authorization. Also consider the extent of judgment involved for the activity. This is where your policies really come in handy, because we hear a lot when policies are gray. It leaves it up to, when you have something you have to do and you have to get it done, you don't want to be the decision-making person. It's not really, that payroll person's job, or maybe even your office's job, to decide what to do with something. So if you can eliminate as much judgment from the individuals performing these duties, your job is really just to follow the written policies of the government, of the county. It also helps with consistent treatment. You might get an instance where you've had to make a decision, and then next year somebody else is in that job, and now the same situations come up. You still haven't addressed it in a policy, and it may be a different decision, and then there's where you get your controversy. Also want to consider the size and volume of individual items comprising the activity. So larger units may want to use an electronic payroll system, whereas a smaller unit, it may be more simple, more efficient for them just to do things manually. Also the comfortability of the people that you have in those positions. How comfortable are they with electronic processes versus manual? So you just want to choose whatever's best for who you have doing those and what needs to be done, and then decide what's going to be the most effective and efficient way to do those things. The organizational structure, again, number of employees, the experience of your staff. Smaller units may need to rely more on their oversight body for segregation of duties, while larger units may accomplish this within their own office with multiple employees. Newer or more inexperienced employees may need more oversight or more segregation of duties, but may be altered later as they become more experienced. So when you develop these controls, it is going to be more of a moving target. You might try something and find out, well, that doesn't work very well. I'm not getting good response. What we're getting isn't accurate. So adjust, change the processes, change the procedures, change the people that are doing it. And then again, if someone, as you get more experienced with something, those people doing those may need less oversight. They may even have a suggestion for a better way to do it or a different system to use. Those are things that you have to continually address as you go through, day-to-day processes. New technology, that's probably one of the biggest risks in payroll. When you change software systems or you get a software update, a lot of times you get glitches in them. So making sure, you may have your internal controls all established, now you've changed software vendors, or they gave you an update, and you still want to go through those same processes. You may have to incorporate more controls just to make sure the calculations are correct, that the rates are in there correct, that the reports are giving you the information that you need, and that you have the proper authorizations in those systems. New or amended laws and regulations. They may require additional training or additional oversight for a certain period of time until the new regulation has been implemented and you've verified that it's working in your system or that your staff understands it. So during the risk assess process, you're going to have to take all of that in, and you're going to have to find your weak areas, and you're going to have to foresee where you might have problems and say, what can we do to mitigate that problem? What can we do to eliminate it or at least minimize the chance that it will happen? And then you develop controls and then adjust as you need to. Control activities. This is where all of your daily, this is where your details are. They should be designed to detect, prevent, or reduce the risks identified during your risk assessment process and also achieve the objectives. It includes detailed processes and procedures of the internal control structures such as reconciliations, authorizations, approval processes, performance reviews, verification processes. Those are just some of the examples of the things that you can do or implement within your internal control structure. In the internal controls manual, it's provided examples of some control procedures specifically for payroll. Just to reiterate, these are just examples. These are not saying you need to do these things or that you should have these specific controls in place. We just thought it might help the ball rolling for you to see some of the things that could be done as controls. So we'll go over some of those now. Salary and wage rates are verified by someone outside the payroll process. Since payroll, for most of you, is probably pretty automated. So you go in at the beginning of the year or at the end of the prior year and you put in all the rates and then you forget about it. Sometimes there's no one else that checks to make sure that whoever's inputting those rates put them in correctly. There can be transposition errors, which you're not going to really see on a regular pay. They could have put in an incorrect rate. They may not have updated someone's rate. So it's important to make sure that if your process is at the beginning of the year, we put them all in, and then the payroll calculates it from that point, what do you do to make sure that it was input correctly? Responsibilities for hiring, terminating, and approving promotions are segregated from those preparing payroll transactions or inputting data. Responsibilities for approving timesheets are segregated from those preparing payroll transactions and inputting data. Payroll adjustment reports are reviewed by someone outside the payroll process. Employee time and attendance records are approved by their supervisors. You'll notice that all of these talk about someone outside of the data entry person doing something else. Again, you can't have one person approving things, entering things, verifying them, and just doing the whole process. If there's errors, it's very unlikely that person is going to catch their own errors. So just making sure that however your system works, that if you see a place where something could happen, that you implement a control that might help mitigate it. It could be an electronic thing, it could be a periodic, it could be a manual process, whatever works for your office. Continuing on with the examples, corrections to record time and attendance records are approved by the employee's supervisor and authorized by management. This is one thing that when we are auditing payroll, we always look into. If we look at a payroll and we notice that there's adjustments made to a payroll, or there's an increase in their salary or a decrease in their salary or any type of unusual change, the first thing we're going to do is where's the authorization for that? Why did you make that correction? So making sure that it's not just one person in charge of that, and making those corrections, making sure that documentation. A lot of times what we'll get when we ask the question is, well, I remember so-and-so called me and told me I needed to do that. Or I think they might have emailed me and told me that was incorrect. But there's no documentation for that. So now we've got a rate of pay that's changed and we don't really have an explanation for that. And there may be nobody else in the office or above that that's aware of that change. So just making sure that you have those authorizations. You may create an internal form that has to be signed off on by somebody else when there's a change made. I've seen those forms implemented in some of the systems, and they work pretty good, especially as documentation. Procedures are in place to ensure that changes in employment status are properly reported to the payroll processing unit. We see this a lot, especially when the county has some retirees that they are paying. You might find that a retiree has passed away and they continue to be paid for several more pays because the payroll person wasn't notified, or someone has been fired or let go or quit for whatever reason, and they don't get it stopped on the date of that. So just making sure that you have a process for that, and then making sure somebody is checking to make sure that that was done. Payroll disbursements are reviewed and approved by the authorized individual prior to payment. Access to payroll applications is appropriately controlled by user logins and passwords. Permissions can be set to allow only certain users to perform certain tasks. A lot of the payroll systems do that, and depending on what type of system you have and what kind of capabilities you have, several of them the data processing person will input the information, but maybe a department head has to go in and authorize it before it can even be paid. That's, again, something you just have to analyze to see what you have available and the staffing that you have available in the processes. Changes to payroll disbursements are approved by an individual other than the ones authorized to make the changes. I think we just kind of hit on that as far as any changes to payroll, making sure that you're getting the proper authorizations to do that and retaining the documentation for it. Payroll checks are accounted for in a numeric order and reconciled to the payroll check register. I know most of you are probably doing direct deposit, and then some of the systems do the direct deposit numbering differently. Some don't even assign numbers. Some have they appear as check numbers. Some of them have direct deposit numbers. So just making sure that direct deposit report, along with if you're doing any manual checks, all of that reconciles to what actually gets paid out. Sometimes your systems will do actual reconciliation reports. Access to signature stamps used to sign payroll checks is adequately controlled, and this is kind of, I don't know how many still do checks, but if there is a signature stamp, there should only be certain people that have access to that. Payroll check stubs are periodically distributed by someone outside the normal payroll distribution function. So I know we do direct deposit, and we would get a notice we would get one in the mail. They used to. They don't do it that way anymore. But even if you're doing direct deposit notices, just making sure that that employee has access to that direct deposit notice or that check stub, whether you deliver them to the departments and they deliver it, same way with the check distribution. There should be someone that those checks go to other than just the payroll person. Unclaimed payroll checks or stubs are returned to an individual other than those involved with the payroll process. Employees are cross-trained on the payroll process. Those assigned to payroll take mandatory vacations. Cross-training is really important, and this goes for really any function, but especially the payroll, because you don't want your employees not to get a check because the payroll person was sick or just quit on no notice, and you have no one else that knows how to run the payroll system or do those functions. So making sure that someone else has the capability of doing those functions, maybe even switching off duties occasionally, and then the mandatory vacations, we have found cases where, people have in charge of payroll never took any time off because they didn't want anyone else to see what they were doing. And but we have, and when they finally do decide to take a leave of absence or they leave or whatever, someone else looks into it and they see some unusual things. So not to say that that is a definite determinant of something going wrong, because there are some workaholics here that really don't want to take vacations, but it is important to cycle that out so that somebody else is at least looking at it. You're also just less likely to have issues if someone knows someone else is looking at it. So just to reiterate, these are just examples. So you have to find what works for your system, your office. But each unit, they have to decide on their own procedures and processes and continue to alter them as they need to. Information and communication. So once you've identified your risks and procedures have been established to address them, it needs to be communicated throughout the agency and to external parties when necessary. This is really important too. So many times, and I spend a lot of time out in the field, and you ask a question about, did anyone do this? And you get, well, that wasn't my job. Okay, well, whose job is it? Well, I don't know. So making sure that everybody knows what their responsibilities are, who they get information from, and who they report back to. So making sure that that line of communication and that flow of information is clear, whether it's in written form. We always prefer written form. Whether you send out memos, however you communicate that information, it's important that everyone knows who does what. The form of communication and documentation of the internal communications between the office, departments, and the oversight bodies is established and communicated to employees. Again, this could involve retaining emails, reports, and memos, maintaining logs for information and communication that's verbal, printing and filing documents, scanning and maintaining electronically, completing internal forms between departments or offices, or any other method that works for the agency. You might find that one form of communication is better than another depending on the position or the department that you're dealing with, or the type of information that you're communicating. You also need to consider any laws and regulations, compliance guidelines, and local policies that may have specific formats or documentation that needs to be retained, or if there's specific ways that things need to be communicated. Because as you go through the guidelines, and I think you've heard us say in different presentations, things have to be written. So keeping that into consideration when developing your information and communication. Board minutes, actions by the board, they have to be written into board minutes, and those have to be retained. So making sure that you're considering that when developing your communication processes. Procedures for feedback on and clarification of information is also important. Feedback is important, especially in identifying errors in payroll and and weaknesses in control processes and procedures. Also to ensure that everyone receives and understands the information. I know our agency, typically if we have a new policy or a significant change, well, we just got a new personnel manual, and one of the things that it was sent to us that it was available, and we had to print off a certification that said we received it and that we reviewed it and understand it, had to sign it, date it, and return it back. So when you have significant policies like that, it is important that you've documented that that communication was received and understood. And it also, a lot of people don't want to say they don't understand something, or a lot of times you'll always get, I didn't get that. So this will eliminate that issue there. But if they have to actually certify that they receive and understand it, they're more likely to ask questions before they sign that certification that says they understand it. So you might get more questions on, I don't understand that process, who do I report that to, or what form do I fill out? It just kind of makes people pay a little more attention. Procedures to ensure that communication requirements are being followed and necessary information is being communicated properly. There's lots of ways to do this as well, possibly assigning periodic reviews of documentation to be sure it is being maintained. Using the example above about the new personnel manual that I just talked about on our agency, one of the things, and this kind of goes back to also the control environment and the tone of the agency. I told you about us getting the new personnel policy and having to sign that and scan it back, and we had a deadline to do that. A day or two before the deadline, our agency head goes to the responsible person and says, give me a list of the people that you have not received those certifications back. Nobody wants to be on that list. We return those certifications pretty quickly, and you don't go past that deadline, or else you have to deal with our agency head. So he kind of sets the tone for our office, and everyone knows if you're asked to do it and you're required to do it, you're going to do it, or else you're going to have to deal with it. So making sure that there's that follow-up. For this specific thing, our agency head, he was the follow-up, and we knew he was going to follow up on it. So making sure that procedures are established to retain public documents. So one of the biggest things is knowing what needs to be maintained. You might possibly have a list and list out what you need to maintain in the format that you need to maintain it in. Having policies for when records are to be eliminated and how they are to be eliminated, making sure that they meet the federal and state requirements. I know I went to one unit and I really liked it. We get the question all the time, what can I get rid of? And we always refer you to the Public Records Division. I know that's not their current name, but I found it interesting that when this particular unit decided that they got tired of going back to that list and determining what and when and how they could destroy it, as she packed things up and put them in the box, she just wrote it right on the box. You can destroy after whatever date. She listed everything in the box, and then, it took her a long time to do that or to develop that process, but she had a schedule. So when she left office and the new person came in, they could go right to, if they were looking to create space, they could look right on the box, and it told them what year that they could destroy those records. It told them what was in that box, and they were all sealed. And then she kept another box that was just miscellaneous stuff that weren't within the public records thing. So, and then internally they would decide how they kept those, or when they kept them and when they destroyed them. So having that already in place kind of eliminates that pile up of documentation that you're not sure what to do with. Maybe even writing it into your policies as to, maybe a certain period where you do that in June or July, or at the end of the year we go through this process every other year, or however that is. Having it already part of your processes helps to eliminate that question about what to retain and what not to. Monitoring. This is a continuous process of periodic checks and using feedback to determine if controls are in place and working effectively. Control activities or your payroll procedures and processes should be reviewed to ensure that they are in compliance with your established policies. So basically, make sure everyone is consistently doing what they're supposed to be doing and that they're doing it in the manner that they're supposed to be doing it in. If deficiencies are found in the internal control processes, they should be documented and actions should be taken to address those deficiencies in a timely manner. It is also important for the oversight body to be a part of that monitoring process, making sure they are aware of the deficiencies and decisions for corrective actions. One of the biggest complaints we get about payroll, a lot of times with smaller units, larger units, is, well, the department doesn't bring me their time records, and I don't know how many hours to pay them, and it could include hourly people, but they work their standard 40 all the time, but you don't have their time records yet, and you have to process payroll. And it's a continuous problem, and we get the question, well, what do I do about that? Well, if your policy is that you have to have those before they get paid, then you're going to want to go to your governing body and say, hey, I'm having an issue. They're not following the control processes. They're not reporting this. They're not providing it to me, and let them deal with that. I know that doesn't always solve your problem, and if it ever becomes that much of an issue, you always, especially with payroll, always consult your human resources and your legal department about what you can do when they don't comply with those policies. Before we move on to the issues and concerns, do we have any questions about internal controls related to payroll? No? Great. So I'm going to go over just some, not a whole lot, just some payroll issues and concerns, things that we get questions on a lot. All these topics can be found in our county bulletins or the compliance manual. Compensation, including establishing salaries and wages, payment and election workers, record of hours worked, benefits, withholdings, and you won't find it on here, but I did add a slide. It's just a very basic slide about the new overtime rules, but those are the things we'll go over. Establishing salaries and wages. All compensation and benefits must be included in the labor contract, salary ordinance, or resolution approved by the county council or specifically authorized by statute. This information, along with more detailed information, can be found in Indiana Code 36-2-5-3 and 3.5. I don't think there's anything new there as far as information. The next point is something that I do want to stress. We get this question a lot. The salary ordinance is separate from the budget ordinance. The Form 144 completed as part of the budget process is not the salary ordinance. The salary ordinance is a separate and distinct ordinance that should not be combined or confused with the ordinance for appropriations, which is under IC Code 36-2-5-11C. We've had several questions about this in the past. From an audit standpoint, the salary ordinance is what we're going to use to look at salaries and wages to make sure that they're in compliance. So your salary ordinance, it's what is approved to be the rates. Now, it should correspond with your budget. They should be building your budget based on what they plan for the wages to be, but it is not the same thing. Whether it's based on an annual amount, biweekly, weekly, or hourly, we'll make sure that the actual amount paid complies with whatever the salary ordinance is and not the budget amount. So if you have a budgeted line item for the county auditor at $60,000, but the salary ordinance says $59,000, we're going to make sure that they got the $59,000. The budget is just what you're allowed to spend, and it doesn't always match up. There's timing issues in payroll. But we're going to make sure that you complied with the way the salary ordinance is written, and if that's on a biweekly amount, hourly, weekly, or annual amount, we're just going to make sure that that's how they were paid. We get the question a lot that, oh, we got to the end of the year and we still have appropriations left in that line item. Can we just pay that out to the employee? No, you cannot do that. Again, you have to pay based on the salary ordinance. An appropriation is an estimate of what you plan to spend for the year. So that making that distinguishment is crucial. We do get a lot of confusion in that process. Payment of salaries. All compensation should be paid through the payroll claims process, including additional pay such as on-call or per-call pay, shift premiums, stipends, or bonuses. The following items are not considered compensation for personal services and should not be paid through the payroll claims, but should be paid through the regular county claims process. Those items would be mileage and travel expenses, per diem for jurors, compensation for pauper attorneys, unless serving as an officer or employee of the county, and witness fees, compensation for precinct election boards, payments to attorneys, engineers, and other professionals when serving on a contractual basis. The method of payment typically is check or direct deposit, but you just need to make sure that it's whatever's authorized by your executive body per Indiana Code 36282. We do get, this last point here, we get questions on all the time. And they want to know whether the county can mandate direct deposit. Indiana Code 36-1-3 provides commissioners with the home rule powers which would allow a policy to be established. However, it becomes a legal matter to determine if you can enforce such a policy. So you're going to have to consult your advisor to say, can we refuse to pay them if they don't sign up for direct deposit? There's nothing that says that you can force them to do it, but it does allow the county to develop or establish a policy that says that we're going to do direct deposit, and as an employee, you're going to do direct deposit. But enforcing that, unfortunately, is going to be a legal issue, so you'll have to consult your legal advisor. Continuing with payment. Well, you can guide them to the county bulletin that says it. It's on the website for the public too, so. Compensation may not be paid in advance. That's supported by Indiana Code 5-7-3-1. That means if they have not performed the services, you should not be paying them before they have performed those services. You can pay them up to the date that they performed them, but that becomes very difficult in calculation and trying to get the proper documentation and processing and everything else. But you just can't pay them in advance of hours they haven't already worked. Compensation should be paid in a manner that complies with the way the salary ordinance is written. This is important. Next point, I'm about to go over the 27 pay. We got a lot of those calls this year. And we've been saying the same thing for years. If a salary ordinance is established salaries on a biweekly, weekly, or hourly basis, then you really don't need to do anything different as far as the payment. If it says their biweekly salary is $1,000, you're going to pay them $1,000 for 27 pays. It doesn't change. Where you run into the problem is when you set the salary ordinance at an annual amount, because that means for the calendar year they only get that amount. So then you have to take that amount and divide it by 27 pays rather than 26. We always recommend that the salary ordinance be developed on a biweekly or weekly or hourly basis so that you don't have this problem. The one thing that you do have to consider is in the budgeting process, when there's 27 pays, if they're biweekly, weekly, or hourly, you have to consider that extra pay in the budgeting process. Typically, if you've got it set at biweekly salaries, you'll multiply that times 26, and there's your budget for the year. Well, in this case, you're going to have to multiply it times 27, and there's your budget. So that's the consideration on the budget side. But as far as the payment side, I know no one likes for their pay to go down whenever they establish an annual salary, and that's what it appears. They're still getting that same salary for the year. It's just they're getting it over more pays. And it's hard to explain that to someone when their biweekly pay goes down. So however the salaries are established, adequate appropriations should be included in the budget to cover the planned disbursements. Election workers. I threw this one in there because this is an election year and we've already getting questions on it. We've also put some information on the website for it as well. But the information provided on our website, and I think I also included a handout with this, an IRS, from the IRS website. Was that listed on the material? But I'm only going to go over a few of the points because the regulations for election workers are really set by IRS. So we're kind of just addressing it from our standpoint as far as the questions that we're getting. One of the first points, election wages are excluded from federal income tax withholding. And the next 2 points are probably the most common questions we get. Election wages paid to a county employee should be through payroll. So if you have a county employee who's also working as an election worker, that should run through payroll. Election wages paid to a non-employee should be paid through payroll if the wages are anticipated to be more than $600 for the calendar year, because the county is going to be required to issue them a W-2. So then that will automatically generate your W-2 through the payroll process. I do want to point out that although a W-2 is not required to be issued for amounts less than $600, election wages are taxable and the worker is supposed to include them on their income tax return. So although you are not required to issue them a W-2, you could still run the wages through the payroll system because, again, the $600 is for the year. So if you have multiple elections and you don't know whether this election worker who's not an employee is going to work multiple elections, you could end up in the situation where you pay them through the regular claims process and then they work more elections at the end of the year and now they're over the $600. Well, now you have to figure out how to get a W-2 issued to them. There's a question?
If the wages are more than $600, that you would issue a 1099. If the wages are more than $1,600 in a year, then you would need to run those wages through payroll.
Let me see if I have the... The document that I included in the meeting materials came off the IRS website as well. Okay. Reading from the IRS, it says government entities must file a Form W-2 for election workers who receive payments of $600 or more, even if no FICA or income tax were withheld. The $1,600, that range from $600 to $1,600, if you look at the other document that we included, I believe has to do with what types of withholdings that you take. But for clarification on those, you would have to contact the IRS because it's their guidelines. We're just providing this as informational purposes. Yeah, if you read the documents there, and like I said, if you have questions on the withholdings or the reporting, you really need to contact the IRS. But from our standpoint, the question we get the most is, do we have to run that through payroll, or can we pay it through regular claims process? But it seems like the $600 is the limit there for running if they're non-employees. Are there any more questions? Well, the auditor's office is going to be responsible for the reporting of that. The question was, who makes the call on whether it goes through payroll, the clerk or the auditor's office? The auditor's office is the one responsible for the reporting. So the payroll department there is going to be responsible for making sure that they're doing whatever they need to ensure that the reporting is going to be correct. And like I said, if you have any questions about whether you need to issue a W-2 or how the withholdings go, you really would want to contact the IRS as far as that's concerned. But just according to the guidelines here, it says $600 or more is a W-2. Are there any more questions on election workers? Okay, next subject, a record of hours worked. The Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, requires that records of wages paid, daily and weekly hours of work, time and day of week, when the employee's work week begins, be kept for each covered employee, non-exempt worker. This is one of the areas, like we talked before, I know that the payroll department struggles with sometimes as far as who has to keep a record of hours worked and who doesn't. This is going to be a question for the Department of Labor in determining whether that employee falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I would first consult, if you have a human resources department, I would talk to them. And then if you need clarification on whether a specific employee has to maintain those, or you have to maintain records for that employee, you want to contact the Department of Labor. However, we've provided forms, and these are manual forms, and most of the payroll processes are automated, I think, on the most part. But we do have prescribed forms. If you use the prescribed forms, they will meet the guidelines for the Department of Labor and their time reporting and records. If you don't use the prescribed forms that we have, you should have something similar in your payroll system that generates that information. So if you already have a system in place and you haven't had any problems with it, I'm sure you're okay. But if you do switch payroll systems, a lot of times the reports look completely different, and you might not be sure if you're getting the adequate information. So they may call the reports something else, and I'd say that most payroll systems do not call their reports employee service records and employee earnings records. Some might. But if you look at the prescribed form and the information that's on those prescribed forms, as long as you have that information available in a report that your system generates, then you would be fine. Okay, benefits. There's just a few things that I want to point out on benefits. The most important is that all types of employee benefits should be detailed in the written policy. So your policies should explain what types of benefits are entitled to employees. The policies should be established by the governing body. In the negotiated labor contracts that are approved by the governing body are considered written policies. Policies should conform to requirements of the federal and state regulatory agencies. Examples of some of the benefits, of course, are the obvious: sick, vacation, personal, and any other type of special leave. Fringe benefits. This one gets a little confusing sometimes, but some examples would be a take-home vehicle or free use of property or services. If you look in the county bulletin, we've had a few questions about this, especially when it comes like to the parks department. They throw in some use of the golf course as part of their salary or those types of things. With fringe benefits, you'll want to contact the IRS and let them tell you whether that is considered a fringe benefit and how it should be reported or included on their W-2. Withholdings. I guess the important thing to remember about withholdings are the withholdings are not the county's money. It's money that's being withheld from an employee's pay for a specific purpose. The county acts as an agent for the withholdings. All withholdings should be tracked and remitted to the appropriate agencies in a timely manner. Taxes, insurance premiums, garnishments, and other authorized withholdings. This is typically done by creating a separate withholding account or fund for each different type of withholding. Again, withholdings funds pretty much act like a clearing account. You withhold the money, you put it into the fund, and then you pay it out to wherever it goes. If you're noticing that your withholdings funds are not clearing out or they're accumulating balances, you should have already had controls in place to monitor those, making sure that you're getting all those withholdings out. Periodic checks of those balances. If you were to go to and look at your withholdings, if you go back to the last time you paid, the only thing that should be in that account is from the last time you paid, any withholdings from that point. So if you're looking at something that's paid out quarterly and you just paid this quarter, the only thing that should be in that fund is whatever you've withheld since the end of last quarter. So doing those types of periodic checks, not to say that you have to do it, daily, weekly, or whatever works for your agency as far as monitoring those funds. So many times these withholdings accounts get out of control. We get some that are in the negative balance because they didn't get it in the right withholding fund and they've paid too much out, or especially with insurance premiums or your FICA Medicare, they've withheld the employee's portion, but then they've paid out the entire amount, employee and employer portion, out of those funds, or the insurance premiums, they've made withholdings, but they've paid the entire claim out of there, which included the county's portion. So if you've got negative balances, you shouldn't have negative balances. You need to investigate those and make whatever corrections. I see a lot of smiles out there. And the same with accumulating balances. If you have balances that are they just never clear out and then they just continue to increase, something may not be getting paid out. You see that a lot, especially with garnishments, because it's not something regular that you always do. You may have a new garnishment and you forgot that you have to remit that to another county, and then it just accumulates. So just making sure that you're monitoring those withholdings balances and getting them cleared out on a timely manner, because so many of you already know that if you have problems with your payroll withholdings accounts and either you've come into the mess or you're trying to clean it up, we hear so many times, oh, this goes back about 10 years. Well, at some point it's got to get cleaned up. Don't let it get that far. So once it's cleaned up, keep it cleaned up. Make sure it's part of your internal controls to monitor those and reconcile those. Outsourcing payroll. We've had several of these questions over probably the last year, and it usually comes from the auditor's office. And usually the question is, can the commissioners make us outsource our payroll? Outsourcing payroll is a management decision. The only thing that we can really say about outsourcing payroll is make sure, since you are the agent, the office that deals with it the most, make sure that you've got your input into it or communicated your concerns. There are pros and cons to anything, internally doing payroll or having an agency do them. But being informed about the services that are going to be provided and the processes that there's going to be an integration from that outsourced payroll to getting into your financial records. So making sure that you understand if they're considering that option, what the risks are. Are you going to have to get reports from the outsourced vendor and manually input that into your system? If that's the case, how much time and effort is that going to take? How much resources? So that helps with the cost analysis benefit, also the efficiency and the effectiveness. Anytime you have to input something from another source, how well do you understand those reports that they're providing you? Are you getting all the information? Are you doing a reconcilement of those? Or are you automatically uploading that information from that outsourced vendor? If you're doing that, you still need to check that information. You can't completely rely on the information they give you and say, if you have issues, it's not my fault. They gave it to me and I inputted, or I uploaded it. You still have to have those controls in place to make sure that the incoming information is accurate, and it's still the county's responsibility to ensure compliance and accuracy of the financial records. So just making sure that you understand what's going to be involved. And as far as outsourcing payroll, it comes in various levels of what that vendor is going to do for you. Obviously, I'm sure the cost goes up with as much as they do. So who's paying the payroll taxes? Are they writing the checks? Are we writing the checks? I mean, all of those things are things that you have to consider, and have to consider the risks of those processes and determining whether that's going to work for your unit. So I just want to stress the importance of internal controls over payroll. I chose payroll to correlate with internal controls because the payroll transactions are a significant part of the transactions that the county does. It's a significant part of their budget. It's a major expense item. They're also highly susceptible to fraud and misappropriation. With smaller units, the segregation of duties can be limited, so making sure that you try to implement some sort of controls, whatever's possible to do. Also, payroll is highly automated, and a lot of times when we get into systems that do everything for us, we're less likely to look at it and we rely on the information that it comes out of it. But it's still susceptible to data entry issues, software glitches. So just making sure that you do have those appropriate checks and balances in place, even though it's automated. Also, if, internal controls with payroll, if you find that you have payroll issues, whether it's fraud or it's errors, it can have a financial impact on the county. Non-compliance could result in penalties and additional charges. It could also affect the accuracy of your financial records and your reporting, and it could also end up in the official being personally liable. So you hear us harp all the time, internal controls, just making sure it is very important, especially to the payroll process. Before I talk about the last topic, are there any questions? One over here.
Okay, I have a couple questions. Back on the stipends, so the way I'm reading this, that if they are not county employees, they still should be paid through payroll. Is that true?
If they're not county, in what situation are you referring to someone getting a stipend that's not a county employee?
Our plan commission, our building department, those boards, the health, the LEPC, they'll get like a $50 stipend on some of them. Is that something that they should
Are
go
they-
through payroll?
They're not paid through payroll? They're
No,
paid
no,
directly?
these are boards that are, they're paid through claims, but I mean, they're just there to make the decisions that need to be made. They've been appointed to the boards, or they've,
Now, are they getting that in addition to their board pay, or are you referring to the stipend as their pay for those services?
right, correct, the stipend is
Okay.
as their pay.
Do they issue them a 1099?
Only if they're over the $600.
Okay. Well, then it sounds like you're doing that appropriately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I have a question on payroll. Okay, in our county, we implemented that you had to do a time card. And our sheriff likes to kind of do things his own way. So
No.
we have the payroll vouchers. And so then we also have now started to have the department heads put, if it's a vacation day, they actually have to log it on there. Because before, it was always up to the department head to make sure that the sick days and all of that is followed as far as the personnel policy manual. So what he submits is the payroll vouchers and then what the employee's work schedule is, or the deputies, anybody over there at the sheriff's department. And then he also has come up with this additional schedule that actually shows the days off. So what he basically is doing is the payroll deputy then has to kind of absorb all of that and kind of work through everything, and then it's up to her to determine the hours that they've worked, which personally I don't feel like should be the payroll deputy that has to determine that. I think the sheriff should be saying that John Doe worked, 40 hours and telling us when they worked.
Does he provide that information with any certification from him? Does he sign that information or send it via email and say, I certify that the following people have worked the following hours, or?
I don't believe it says I certify. It's just, he's got the payroll voucher signed, and then he's just got all of those
He signs-
documentations.
Okay, he signs the payroll voucher?
Yeah.
Okay. So I
Which
guess.
I guess is certifying, but you're looking at the payroll
Yeah.
voucher. But, here again,
It puts him responsible for those hours. That payroll voucher, if it has the hours worked on it and the rate of pay and all of that, it is acting as, it's accomplishing the requirement as far as reporting the record of hours worked, how they maintain that detail. If you have a county policy that governs how they're supposed to do that, then you're going to be dealing with more of a policy issue. Now, in order for you to process that payroll, if he's providing you something that he's signing and it has a list of his employees and the hours they worked and everything that it's supposed to have, then he's saying that he's verified that and that's what it is. You're okay to process that on the payroll side of that. But if the county has a policy on the way they're supposed to do stuff, then it could be a violation of your county policy.
yeah, we're in the processes of working on our county policy because ours is very vague.
Most of them are. We've been seeing them getting better, and like I had said before, policies seems like I've been with State Board of Accounts for 19 years, so I've seen the way things have progressed. And looking back when I first started, policies were very vague. They were very gray. You told them they had to establish a policy, they're like, okay, here it is. And that was their policy. With encouraging your governing bodies to make those policies as specific as possible, it makes the county officials in those offices, it takes more of the judgment out of their hands. Your job is to comply with those policies. And when they are vague, it makes it very difficult for you because then you do this back and forth with, what do I do with this? I don't want to make that decision. It really should be your governing bodies, and it should go back to your policies. So if you're able to communicate as much information when they're developing those policies as far as here's our concerns or here's what we think we need when they're developing those, we just always encourage policies to be as specific and detailed as possible because it's just easier for those departments out there to make sure that whatever they're doing complies with the policy, and it leaves their judgment out of it.
And then something, I'm sorry, I don't mean to hog the microphone here, but something else that's an issue, I'll say, in our county, and department heads and even elected officials have been made aware, such as, somebody who just loves to get up in the morning, they love mornings, and so our hours are from 8 until 4:30, but they come in at 7:30 every day, and, they open up the computers, they do this, that, and everything else, and they've been told that you cannot do that because this employee should be compensated between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. But when you're talking elected officials and they, it's like they just blow it off, is there, if the IRS or somebody would come in, I'm sure that the county would be penalized for it. But how do you make these people adhere to what is, legal?
Well, elected officials are a little bit different than other
I'm not talking
employees.
the elected official themselves, I'm talking about an employee in their office.
Yeah.
Okay.
I, when it comes to payroll issues like that, yes, you're correct. If they're coming in and they're working when they're coming in or in an official capacity, you come into the labor laws. It's something, like I said, if you have a human resource department, talk to them about it or consult with your legal advisor as far as those hours, and because yes, you could be getting yourself into a situation, and we have had instances where we've had situations like that, and now you've either let an employee go or they've quit, and they come back and say, hey, I want to be compensated for all these hours I wasn't paid for. Then you have to deal with that. So
Right.
that is something that you could address in your policy, and I have seen policies that specifically state that you are not to clock in until whatever time. It goes down to clocking out for lunch, not being able to work through lunches. You want to make sure that your policy maybe incorporates those labor laws and the ones that you want to make sure that you're complying with, because they can, especially when you have a disgruntled employee or ex-employee, the first thing they want to do is try to say you owe them money or that you're violating their rights or anything like that. So you want to deal with your legal advisor and your human resources department when developing that policy. And I would encourage putting those specifics in the policy so that when they do that, you can tell them, hey, you can't do that right here. You were aware of it. You have the policy. It gives you a ground to stand on.
Right. I promise this will be my last question. Just in case you already know the answer, on the fringe benefits, are uniforms, if we are buying uniforms, let's say the highway department, our maintenance, is that a fringe benefit that they need to be taxed on? And if you don't know, that's fine. I just thought when you brought it up, I would just ask.
I would say that you might want to ask the IRS on that, but it probably does come down to a few things as far as, do they get to keep those uniforms? Are they their personal property, or are they the county's property? Because we do see uniforms supplied and the county washes them and returns them, but when that employee leaves, they don't take those uniforms with them. It's part of their work requirement that they wear those, and that's actually the county's property. So it may have something to do with that, but I would say contact the IRS with the specifics and they could probably give you more guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions before I go over the last payroll slide? Oh.
We used to have that problem, but everybody has to turn in a timesheet. The timesheet and the voucher have to match, and you'd be amazed how many times they don't. We send them back and make them, if the employee says they work this amount of time, the employer says they work that amount of time, they need to fix it, get it back to us. So we pretty much did away with that, and they're certifying under perjury or some legal mumbo-jumbo on their timesheet that this is what they worked.
Yes.
So they can't come back because this is what they said they worked. That's it.
Yeah. And what she's saying there, the prescribed form for like the timesheets or time cards has an employee signature and a department head signature. One of the concerns when you were talking about just someone else accumulating the time based off of work schedule is you're not getting that employee's certification. Like even when we do our payroll, we submit our payroll, but then we have to type in our PIN which certifies that we worked those hours. So that is something that you do want to consider on the way your payroll process works, and making sure that you're covering the county in those types of aspects. Getting those employees to certify their time does eliminate that later on, maybe not completely eliminate, but it does cover later that they certified their own time. So it is a good control to have that in place.
We paid $10,000 to 2 guys at the jail, and that the sheriff started turning in all of his stuff to me. So, but another thing we do is we flag payroll and we flag claims, and the commissioners have to act on it on an individual basis. When I tell them I'm going to flag the claim, it's going to come up in a commissioner meeting, you'd be amazed how much of it gets worked out before it gets there.
Yeah, well, and that's where we talk about with the internal controls and the oversight and involving your governing body. When you're having issues like that, you know, forcing them to deal with those issues or make those decisions kind of helps you out with eliminating your judgment in those situations. And incorporating those into your internal control policies, and people that know that if they do this and this is what's going to happen ahead of time, you are less likely to have those problems. So when you do get your controls in place, writing those down and making them formal control processes and making people responsible for their job duties is critical, because like I said before, you go out and you get fingers pointing in 9 different directions and nobody knows who was supposed to do what because that's not their job. And you go to a job description and it's written so vague that, yeah, I can see where they don't think it's their job and no one else thinks it's their job. So assigning those duties and writing them into the job descriptions, even if you have to alter those, you know, maybe you have to cut back and now you've eliminated an employee and that employee's duties are divvied out, rewrite the new job descriptions for those other positions so that they include those and that those employees know that they are now responsible for those. So formalizing whatever you can really helps out a lot. Any more questions? No? Okay. Oh, we got a hand up over here. I think she waited until I said done, and then she threw that hand up there just to make Lori walk all the way back over.
Thank you. We just recently, this last year, went to electronic payroll, but we have still had the departments turn in a hard copy. And that is what we used then to balance to what they've actually done electronically. And we haven't been audited yet, so we were, concerned with, changing anything until we do get audited, just to make sure that our process is compliant. Our IT director or assistant director has wanted to implement a paperless, or going more paperless. And so he thought the first place to go was maybe do the payroll. And so not to keep the hard copy of the payroll voucher. So what does State Board of Accounts say about that?
The actual payroll voucher that's signed?
Yes,
and
the hard copy.
I think they still have to keep those, don't they? It's part of it. It's just like a claim.
Yes.
Are they recreating that same voucher in an electronic format that has a signature of some sort?
No.
They just want to get rid of the form itself.
Yeah, it goes through an approval process, workflow, but it's not the actual prescribed form that is sent to us.
So what's submitted to the commissioners for approval on the payroll?
Oh, that is.
Okay, then, now are you talking about the actual payroll voucher like
Yes.
the departments
Yes.
usually sign? So they
Yes.
go in and they electronically sign?
Yes.
And then a report is submitted electronically to the commissioners?
And they get a hard copy,
They get a hard copy?
but it's a
Okay.
report.
Okay. I don't know.
It's okay to say no.
Well, we're all for
I
paperless.
just told him I would ask.
We are all for paperless. I would just, what kind of documentation is there available in the system or reports available showing that authorization of that particular, I assume each department has their own login, and it would somehow show that this
Yes.
person approved it on
Yes.
whatever date and time and
Yes.
whatever. I don't have, we might have to get back with you on that question.
Okay,
but-
that sounds
I mean,
great.
I hate to tell someone to stop using a form that
Right.
includes a signature until, but the new forms approval process is, you don't submit them up to, I hope you're all aware of that. It's been out in the county bulletin and everything. During your audit, you're supposed to maintain a list of any forms that you're replacing prescribed forms with, or you're altering or changing. So this would be one thing that you would put on that list, and then during the audit, you're going to have to provide the documentation that would replace that form. And as long as they don't have a problem on the audit site, because they're the ones that's actually going to see it and see whether it's working and that it has adequate documentation. As long as they don't have any problems, or you don't get any any feedback that you need to change anything, then that would be considered approved at that
Okay,
point.
I'll just tell them to wait till after we get audited and double check.
Probably
then.
not a bad idea.
Thank you.
Okay, any more last minute pop-up hands? Just yell. No? Okay. The last slide here you won't find in the PowerPoint presentation that was put on the website before. It has been updated. It just includes this last slide, and there's not really a whole lot of information, but we have already received a few questions. It's in regards to the new overtime rule. And really the only thing we want to say about it is that elected officials, according to the regulations, elected officials, making appointees, and their personal staff and legal advisors who are not subject to the civil service laws. This does not apply, we're just going to leave out the rest of them. This does not apply to elected officials. So auditors, it does not apply to you. And that's all we're going to say about that. If you need additional guidance about the new rules, you're going to want to contact the Department of Labor. However, and I'm sure you've all heard about, the revamping of our website and the different things that we have. Hot topics. We have put an article in our Hot Topics section on the county's webpage that provides some information directly from the Department of Labor's website. It's already on there. We put it on before we came to conference. So if you want to read through that, that might give you some more clarification. But if you have specific questions, you're going to want to talk to your Human Resources Department, your legal advisor, or Department of Labor when it comes to this new law. We have not had time to really research it. We may be able to provide some guidance later, possibly, but it's probably going to be consult your legal counsel and Department of Labor. It's their rules. So